Welcome to the studio review for chapter 4 on classes. This is part 1 of 2 different chapters that are about classes. And both of the studios are about this restaurant menu. This is just the first one where you're not going to be writing any kind of major methods or anything like that. You're just going to be mostly designing what the data should look like for each of these classes and then implementing just those first parts. So the idea here is that you've been hired to create an application for a restaurant. They want to display their current menu and also be able to edit it. And you're not going to build an actual application. You're going to just design. But, because the planning part is important. So this part is where you really just want to think through how each piece of data needs to be according to the requirements from the restaurant owner. So it says here, after talking to the owner, you have these details. The menu will have several menu items, of course. Each menu item has a price, a description, and a category. And that category is going to be one of 3 values: appetizer, main course, or dessert. It should be possible to display whether a menu item is new or not. So you'll need to know, how long ago it was added to be able to determine that. And you also need to make sure that there's some way to track when the menu itself was last updated with, one or more new menu items, so that visitors can see that the restaurant's constantly changing and adding exciting new items. Okay. So this means you have 2 classes that you want to design: a menu, which will, have a way to hold all the menu items for the menu, and a menu item itself, which again is going to have things like price, description, category, is it new or is it not new, that sort of thing. So you need to plan out, how many fields should these classes have? What are their data types? What are their access levels? And then think about how the constructor might, be defined depending on which of the fields need to be instantiated when you create an object of the class. Don't worry too much about the methods that you might think are needed. You really aren't going to be writing a main method just yet to, create objects of these classes and make them interact and have functionality. You really just want to think about the data. So they do mention here that it might be useful to use one or more of the classes provided by Java, such as date, which was part of java.util, but there's a updated one since Java 8 came out. Java.time will give you local date and several other classes that will be helpful. So this is on W3 School's website. When you look up Java date, this is what you're going to find. So you might want to look into that a little bit. But the first thing that you need to do is to come up with this design. If you're working with someone else to solve this together, each person kind of, think about it on your own a little bit, and then present your ideas and talk about it and make decisions together. And think about, the use cases. What kind of things might happen that would require the data to be organized a certain way. And once you've done that, then you're going to actually go into the code and actually, add some of your information. I will say this, as of today, when I'm recording this, Launch Code inadvertently put some code with these classes in the starter code in the main branch for the classes part 1 directory. But you should delete those and start over with your own, because those really aren't supposed to be there until the part 2, and that's a separate directory. They are going to remove it as of today. It may not yet have been done. Even so, you may have already cloned and this repo down to your local machine, and so you probably will still have these classes existing, but ignore them because you really want to come up with your own thing. There are multiple ways to do this, and you don't need to be tied to exactly how Launch Code has done it. So, think through this, and once you have come up with your own, I will kind of show you what I came up with, and then I will code that out for you. So if you haven't done it yet, go ahead and pause this video, take a minute to, think this through, and come up with your own ideas, and then unpause and we'll continue. Okay, so this is what I came up with. I've got, I just basically did a spreadsheet so that I could kind of keep everything really super organized. And I decided for now, all I'm going to do are the fields, constructors, and getters and setters. And that's it for today. And then the next studio will be where I start thinking through some of the instance methods and other special methods that can be overridden, things you're going to learn about in chapter 5. We'll work on that next time. So for now, I thought about the menu and I said, okay, the menu needs to have a list of menu items. So I'm going to say that I'm going to have an array list that is of the menu item objects. So that's the type. And then I'm going to make it private so that I can control exactly how it's accessed. And then I'll call it menu items, and I'll just make it an empty array list to begin with. We won't have added anything when we create the menu for the first time. And then I also want to have a way to track when the menu was last updated by adding, anything to it. So I'm going to make that this, and this really should say, I'm going to fix this. This should say local date. So I am going to give this a default constructor because I don't really have anything I need to give it right when I'm creating the menu. I'm going to be adding those items after the fact. And this, last updated can just be null until we actually add something. So then, the getters and setters, I might want to access those menu items to grab that list so that I can pull it into my main method in another class. So I will have a getter for that, but I'm not going to have a traditional setter for it because I'm going to write my own method that takes care of both adding a menu item and then also updating this local date at the same time. You could start with a getter and then just modify it, or you can just create your own instance method. Either way, I don't need to worry about that right now. I really am just interested in getting this data set up. So that's it for menu. For menu item, I thought about all the things that they talked about in the instructions. It needs to have a name, a description, a price, a category, and we also need to know how to tell whether it's new or not. And to me, the best way to do that is to have a date that is part of the data that you can always calculate from. And that way, maybe the date was 30 days ago. And so you'll say, oh, that's still pretty new. Maybe it was, 300 days ago. And you'll say, nope, that is definitely not a new menu item. But we can make that decision at the point at which we're displaying the information rather than having some sort of Boolean that would just say it's new or it's not with no reference point for when that was established, right? So we really need to just kind of say, we're going to have this date added, we'll store it with this item, and then we'll always be able to tell, from whatever today is, we can subtract and figure out how long ago it was and have some sort of logic to say, maybe it's 90 days. That's how we decide whether something is new or not, if it's 90 days or less. So we'll do that. And then for the constructor, we want to be able to pass in the name, description, price, and category. And of course, I've given these, the types. They're strings, they're doubles, or this one's a double, this one's a string. And of course, I'm going to set them all to private so that the only way that I can control them is with the getters and setters. But here, I don't need local date to be a parameter. I don't need to pass that in. I can just say, we're going to create a new local date that'll be the current date of whatever day this object is created. That'll be the date added, right? So I don't need that to be a parameter for my constructor. And then for the getters and setters, I pretty much just have both for the name, the description, price, and category, which makes sense. You want to get them, you want to set them. For the date added, we don't need to set it after it's been initialized in the constructor, but we might want to access it, right, in order to do our math. So I'm just going to go ahead and make the get date added public, and everything else. All the setters here are all default, which means they're package private. So any class inside the same package has access to them, and that's all that's necessary. Okay, so that's that's the way that I kind of thought through this. You might have done something completely different, and that's totally okay. There are different ways to solve this, but I'm going to go ahead and go forward with coding this out as I've come up with it. And hopefully that'll help you see just one way to think this through. Okay, so again for today, if you come in and you find that in the classes part 1 directory up here, if you go into studio and go into restaurant menu and come all the way down here to java.org.launchcode, you may find that these things are here. I'm going to go ahead and say I want to refactor them and do a safe delete and get rid of those because those were not meant to be there, and LaunchCode will be fixing it, but you might still see them if you have an older version of the code. So I'm going to instead come up here, oops, cancel. Accidentally clicked on something I shouldn't have clicked on. Okay, I'm going to say new Java class, and I'm going to call it menu item. And now I'll just be starting from scratch. So we're in the package org.launchcode. I've got my menu item class, and I want to go ahead and use these fields, get these things declared. I'm not going to initialize any of them at the point of declaration. So just declare them. So we have name, description, price, category, and then the date added. All right, so I'm going to come up in here and say private string name, private string description, private double price, private string category, and then private, and I'm going to use this final keyword. We haven't really talked about this much yet, but it just basically means it can't be changed after it's instantiated, but I'm not going to instantiate it just yet. So it'll let us change it. It'll let us set it in the constructor, and then it won't let us set it again after that. Okay, so this local date, I failed to do the import. So there we go. So that brings in the java.time package, and that's where we can get that local date class from. Okay. All right, so we have that. I'm going to see why it's yelling at me here. It might not have been initialized. Yeah. So IntelliJ is smart enough to know you have to actually give that something, but we're about to. So that's no problem. All right. So I can create a constructor here. I can do it myself or, little bit by bit, or I can come down here and do this generate and say I want to get the constructor, and I want the constructor to include name through category. So I'm going to use a shift key to have these 4 selected and say okay. And boom, we've got ourselves a nice constructor there. Remember that Java constructors have the exact same name as the class, and they should be marked public. They do not have any additional keyword like constructor or something like that, like you might have with JavaScript. You just say public and then the name of the class, and then you give it any parameters that are required. So I decided, again, this was part of my planning, that I said I wanted these 4 to be parameters, but not this one. However, I do want to add another line of code inside this method. Remember that constructors are actually methods. They're just special methods, but it's going to execute each of these lines of code and say, okay, the name that I declared up here, we're going to set that to be the name that was passed in, and so on and so forth. The field that belongs to it gets the values that are passed in at the time of instantiation of an object of this class. So this final line of code is going to be this dot date added, and I'm going to say local date dot now, and just say when we instantiate something, go get the date right this moment, and then that's the date we want to store with this. And then because I marked it final, it can't be changed. It will always be that value now that it's been instantiated, initialized. Okay. So the last thing to do is to add the getters and setters. And again, I can use, I can do getters and setters for all 4 of these as planned. for the name, the description, and just go ahead and use the default of what IntelliJ provides for us here. And then I'll do it again, but I only want the getter for, there we go. I only want the getter for local date, for date added, I mean, because we have already set it, it's final. There's no reason to have a setter. Okay, so that's all we really need to do for now for menu item is to get all of this set up. So there we go. So now that we have that, we can add our second class. And I'm going to say this is our menu class that will actually represent the entire menu with multiple menu item objects stored in it. In order to do that, we're going to need to establish that array list we talked about, right? So again, the only fields I need are menu items and last updated. All right. So I'm just going to say private array list, and I'll import that. And then this is going to be a menu item, a list of the menu item objects. So that's how we declare the type for that. And then I'm going to call this menu items and say new array list, and just let it be an empty array list as its initial value. And then here I will do my second field, local date is the type. And I need to import that as well. And then I'm just going to call it last updated. And I will not give it a value here. And so we can actually come down. We don't need a constructor. We're just going to allow for a default constructor because we don't need to have any parameters passed in when we create a menu. And then, so that means the last thing to do is getters and setters. We had established here that really the only thing we want to have is a getter for the menu items array list. So I can do just a getter just for menu items and say, okay. All right, so that's going to be it, actually. Yeah, so that's all that's really needed for part one of this studio. We will, certainly continue on with the rest of it, adding some methods and adding a main menu, a main method in kind of, our class that we want to have. And, you might call it main, you might call it a restaurant, however you want. And that will actually be where we have the executable code that will allow us to create some of these objects and run some of the methods to, add them to the list and update some of these, update the last updated date on the menu, things like that. So that functionality we'll think about next time. So for now, if you got this far, this is all you needed to do. All right, I will see you in the next one.